what you are basically. Deep, deep down, far, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Parallel Mind Podcast, episode number 60. In tonight's show, we are going to be looking back at the history of the elite's war on financial freedom, from the war on gold to the war on cash. And now, of course, we are entering the war on financial freedom period, as they seek to tokenize the world, put all of our assets, including physical assets, into a registry, throw it all on the blockchain, eliminate cash, and that's what we're going to focus on tonight, and bring in digital currencies, which will enable them to erase all privacy and economic independence and introduce a literal beast system straight out of Revelations. Now, this episode came about following a recent trip me and Art Money took to Sweden, during which we got to experience up close and personal just what a cashless society looks like. Now, this was something we had no idea about until we arrived there. We'd exchanged our Polish złoty over to Swedish krona. We had a bundle of notes in our pocket, but once we got there, we found out that pretty much nowhere accepts the physical cash anymore. So they literally have gone cashless. It's not just something they have opted to do. It's been engineered, and now you actually cannot use it in what we found out to be 95% of places. So in part one, I'm going to be laying out the history of the war on cash and the development of digital currencies. We're going to go through that step by step. What were the key events along the way? And then in part two for members, we're going to be laying out what we experienced in Sweden. So I'm going to be joined by Art Money to discuss our experiences. And we essentially got to experience what it would be like if you had your CBDC or your digital wallet switched off. So let's imagine that future. What would it look like if they switched you off? Well, that was us, because cash was no longer accepted. We were essentially screwed. So we're going to explore what the philosophical questions around that were in part two. So another packed episode to get into. Members, please head over to parallelmic.com to listen to the full episode. If you're not a member yet, please consider joining us. In part two, I get to put out some of the stuff that would be censored elsewhere. So if you enjoy part one, you will love part two. In closing, I hope you're all well, healthy, and happy. And like always, I'll see each and every one of you in the next one. Okay, everyone, let's get into it. So I'm going to begin with a quote because I really want to lay out how we got to the point in which we are actually defending fiat money. Of course, that's quite an obscure thing. Why are we demanding that we keep cash when that cash is fiat and we don't like the fiat money? Well, that's an interesting story. So let's get into it. And I'm going to begin with a quote about Marco Polo. Almost 750 years ago, a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo wrote a remarkable book chronicling his travels in China. The book of the marvels of the world was full of strange foreign customs that Marco claimed to have seen. But there was one that was so extraordinary, Marco Polo could barely contain himself. Tell it how I might, you never would be satisfied that I was keeping within truth and reason. What had excited Marco so much? He was one of the first Europeans to witness an invention that remains at the foundation of the modern economy: paper money. It was made from a black sheet derived from the bark of mulberry trees, signed with multiple officials and with a seal smothered in bright red vermilion, authenticated by the Chinese Emperor Kublai Khan himself. The chapter of Marco Polo's book was titled somewhat breathlessly, "How the Great Khan Causes the Bark of Trees Made into Something Like Paper to Pass for Money All Over His Country." The point is that whatever these notes were made of, their value didn't come from the preciousness of their substance, as with gold and silver coin. Instead, the value was created purely by the authority of the government. So this is the first historic documentation, listeners, of physical paper money that was backed by nothing, what we call today fiat money. And fiat is actually Latin. It's an expression that means something along the lines of let it be done, which denotes to a command or an order that is spoken into existence with little or no effort. So fiat money is just that. It is money that is imbued with value purely because somebody tells us that it is. It's designed by an order, not by something intrinsic. Now, your ears may have pricked up when you heard that he was from Venice. Yes, he was an agent of the Venetians, so he was backed by the wealthy Venetian oligarchs who, as we know, were the Roman nobility who fled to Venice to set up their banking operations. So he was one of the banksters' men, and what his job essentially was to travel around the world and bring back intelligence. So he was an intelligence asset, and he made his way to China, and this is where fiat money was first embarked upon. And of course, this would have been absolutely astounding to him because, historically speaking, for people to use money, that money had to be something of value. They had to trust in it. And yet here he saw in China people going around with bundles of paper, agreeing to use these pieces of paper and handing over real stuff for them. And this was how it was working over there. So this would have been great intelligence for him to take back to the Venetian bankers. And sure enough, a few hundred years later, Europe was using fiat money also. But that was a long and storied journey, which I've covered in previous episodes, including vampire bankers and the central bank scam. And if you haven't listened to that episode, part 1 and part 2 is an absolute must for understanding the history of central banking. Now, I'm not saying that there wasn't past experiments with money, of course. There had been many over time. In more primitive societies, we used wooden sticks called tally sticks. We used seashells. They was all used as a form of money. But as knowledge and sophistication increased, it was always gold and silver that we defaulted to. They became the money par excellence for reasons we all know. Now, this was actually extremely important, and this is something that is lost on a modern audience, in that when we had a monetary system that involved gold and silver, this acted as a natural limiter to the power of the banksters, because when they wanted to make loans, they had to actually risk their money, which was gold and silver. It was a literal form of money. Of course, they came up with every single possible way of trying to rig the game in their favor and ensure they never lost more than they risked. So they came up with things like collateralized lending, or Lombard lending, as it was once known because of the region the banksters were coming from, which was the Lombard region. So they would lend people money, which was, of course, gold and silver, real things of intrinsic value, and the banksters did not want to lose their gold and silver because that was the family fondo, that was their intergenerational wealth, that was their power. So they would look for people who had assets that they could lend money against, called collateralized lending. Now, of course, the most important asset is land, because once you have land, you can produce goods, you can produce commodities that you can then sell on to businesses, or you can trade with other nations. So the Lombard lenders, the Venetians, the Genoans, the Milanese, all of the wealthy banking families from those regions, they were looking for people who had land, and they would lend against it. Now, of course, the farmers made the perfect borrower, because for farmers to make money, they need to have some capital early in the season before the products are even produced. So they need money to actually get their operations up and running early in the season, and then they make all of their money at the end of the season. So this is where banking could really take off, because they could lend to the farmers when they were not actually selling product, they were planting and growing, and then they could get paid back when the season was done. So this would be at the end of the season. Now, the banksters over time realized that actually we don't want to be paid back. What we actually want is the land. Because of course, if you're a clever bankster, you will lend far less than the collateral is actually worth. And if that's the case, you don't want those people to pay back the loan. So to give you an example, let's imagine that a farmer has a piece of land that is worth 5,000 gold florins. Well, you would lend him 2,000 gold florins against that piece of land that is worth 5,000. And if he doesn't pay you back, you get a 5,000 florin piece of land for only 2,000 gold florins. So this is what these families excelled in, and they became very rich very quickly because they had an awful lot of gold. Having fled Rome as it was dying, they fled across to Constantinople, but many of them settled in other parts of Italy. They created the city-states, the infamous Italian city-states. They were all warring with each other, but they were also making lots of money by gobbling up all of the land, making loans on it, and on occasion trying to engineer situations where the farmers would be forced to default on those loans. Now, despite the predatory banking that was taking place when it came to small-time farmers or regional landowners, eventually the banksters really had to start putting up more risk because they wanted to earn more and more profits. They were greedy, remember, these were greedy people, and they decided, well, How about we lend to kings and monarchs, to queens, to big noble families as they go to war, because they understood that war is the most profitable of all businesses. Yes, my friends, nothing has changed. If you want to know why there's a war in the Middle East, why there's a war in Ukraine, why the US has been in a never-ending war since its inception, it's because war is the most profitable business for banksters. That is why all of European history is filled with nonsensical wars. And this was what the banksters realized all the way back in the Italian city-states. Now, of course, back then they were lending gold and silver. So that meant that if the war went wrong or somebody defaulted, they would lose or stand to lose an extraordinary amount of money themselves. Now, of course, they did their best to ensure that never happened. They would lend to both sides of the war, something that the Rothschilds were famous for. And they made sure that whoever lost the war, they would honour the debts of the vanquished. But it certainly wasn't risk-free for the banksters, and there was many times in history where somebody came along and just said to the banksters, screw you guys, we're not paying our debts. And this was always a huge risk. And that is why gold and silver was a far better system than the fiat system, because of course, if you think you might lose your entire family's wealth by lending too much in the war, at least you're going to be somewhat hesitant. And trying to reclaim your money from a king that has an army, a standing army, and an entire nation of people that could be sent to war is far more difficult than trying to get your money back from a local landowner, especially when you have more power than they do, and you can simply take the land off them because they put it up as collateral. Whereas when you're lending to nations, you have to get them to promise that they will honor the debts of the losers and they will pay you back out of what? Well, of course, taxation. You are the collateral on that loan, my friends. That's where taxation comes in. So it was a much bigger risk, and this is actually what almost collapsed the most infamous bank of the Renaissance period, which was the Medici Bank. The Medici Bank was the largest enterprise coming out of Florence at the time, and they had branches in Belgium, they had branches in London. And for the War of the Roses, which was the English Civil War, they lent hundreds of thousands of gold florins. So they lent an awful lot of money to King Edward, and he lost his war and then he couldn't pay. Now, there are ways to get back at nations who don't pay. You use spies, you use manipulation, you use blackmail, you use assassinations, and all this was going on too. So there was lots of engineering. But when the London branch of the Medici Bank lent that money to King Edward and he refused to pay them back, the bank collapsed and they were owed 51,533 gold florins at the time, and it all went into default and they never received a single one of those back. All he could do was give them preferential trading rights, which didn't save them. The bank collapsed. So that was the risk. There was risk that had to be put up. Now, today, of course, is zero risk for the banks. The collateral that is put up is our money, our assets, as we know with the Great Taking. So today, they have zero risk, and that is why we have the world we've got. So my point in all of this is that fiat money, as was practiced in the Tang Dynasty, was an absolute revelation to the banksters, in that this represented to them the most beautiful alchemical sorcery, this dark sorcery in which they could make gold out of lead, or in this case, paper. And this enabled them to keep their gold, to keep their silver, to keep their lands and palaces with no worry of ever losing it. So long as they could protect it from other oligarchs, they could become the forever oligarchs. And this is where things like the Council of Ten and the families came from. It was an amazing discovery, and Marco Polo took it back to Venice with him. Of course, it was a long and arduous road before we got to full-on central banking and purely fiat money. This took many, many years, and there was lots of politicians that tried to push back against it. We had kings being murdered, we had civil wars fermented, we had revolutions that took place in France, for example. All of this was part of the story, and I'm going to be laying some of that out in future episodes, and I've laid it out in past episodes. But for the sake of tonight, we just have to go over this one simply. Fiat money began in Tang Dynasty China. Marco Polo brought it back, and the banksters decided that their goal, their ambition would now to be create a purely fiat system in which they had central banks and they would loan at interest to nations, putting up nothing of value themselves. That was their ultimate goal and dream. And by 1913, they had succeeded in it. And here is a quote directly from Marco Polo's own diary about the fiat system that he saw in Tang Dynasty China. With these pieces of paper made as I have described, he, Kublai Khan, causes all payments on his own account to be made, and he makes them pass universally over all of his kingdoms and provinces and territories, and whithersoever his power and sovereignty extends, and nobody, however important he may think himself, dares to refuse them on pain of death. And indeed, everybody takes them readily, for wheresoever a person may go throughout the great Khan's dominions, he shall find these pieces of paper current, and shall be able to transact all sales and purchases of goods by means of them, just as well as if they were coins made of pure gold. And all the while they are so light that 10 bezants worth does not weigh 1 gold bezant. Furthermore, all merchants arriving from India and other countries and bringing with them gold or silver or gems and pearls are prohibited from selling to anyone but the Emperor Khan. He has 12 experts chosen for this business, men of shrewdness and experience in such affairs. These appraise the articles, and the emperor then pays a liberal price for them in those pieces of paper. The merchants accept his price readily, for in the first place they would not get so good a price from anyone else, and secondly they are paid without any delay, and with this paper money they can buy whatever they want anywhere in the empire. Whilst it is also vastly lighter to carry on their person, it is also a truth that the merchants will several times in the year bring wares to the amount of 400,000 bezants, and the grandsire pays for all of that in paper. So he buys such a quantity of those precious things every year that all his treasures are endless, whilst all the time the money he pays with costs him nothing at all. Moreover, several times in the year, proclamation is made throughout the city that anyone who has gold or silver or gems or pearls, by taking them to the mint, shall get a handsome price for them. And the owners are glad to do this, because they will find no other purchaser will give so large a price. So the emperor was enacting a purely fiat system here, everyone, and he would buy things of real value: gold, silver, jewels, spices, any fine wares that were brought into the empire that he ruled, and he would overpay in paper. And what I mean by that is he would give them more purchasing power in paper than they would get if they sold them to anyone else. Now, how did he get away with this, given that the paper was intrinsically worthless? Well, first and foremost, he ensured that everybody under punishment of death accepted the paper. So this was rule by force. However, so long as he kept those paper issues limited, it would actually work. Fiat systems can work, as we saw with greenbacks, so long as you don't print them so much that people start to say, well, this actually is just paper. So long as you can maintain a value in the paper and have a closed system, then it can work for a time. Now, of course, that never works in practice, because over time, whether it's kings or queens or governments, they always print more paper. They always do it because it's effortless to do, and to gain more power and to gain more wealth, they debase the currency. So that's why a fiat system never works over time, because human nature says that they will always print more. But in theory, if they just printed one issue and never increased the money supply, it could work in a closed system. But like I just said, it never actually plays out that way, and that is why fiat systems are no good. We need to have money that is backed by something, and where somebody can take those fiat notes and exchange them for something static, something pure, something that is limited in supply and has intrinsic value. And historically that was gold, which is why we had the gold standard, where you could take your fiat notes and change over your notes for gold at a fixed price, and this would keep a limiter on the printing of the fiat notes. The moment you take away that limiter, of course, at some point somebody's going to start debasing that currency, and that is exactly what happened in the Great Khan's dominions. Over time, he started to debase the currency. So whilst he amassed an extraordinary amount of wealth, because he was literally just printing these pieces of paper and buying up all the gold, silver, and all of the other stuff, over time he would exceed the limits, and that led to the collapse of the empire. And of course, we've seen this play out many, many times since then throughout history. In fact, there's been thousands and thousands of fiat currencies, and they've all ended up going to zero. They all start promising us that they're going to retain their value. Usually they back the first issue of the currency with gold and silver to make people trust them, but over time they start to debase the currency. Eventually they just pull gold and silver out of it entirely, and then of course we get to the stage where it just inflates, and eventually the currency dies. And that is exactly what is happening today. Since 1971, we've had a purely fiat system, and all of our currencies have devalued 99% against gold, which would have been included in their original issue. So if you go to Great Britain, for example, a £1 coin used to be a gold sovereign. Today, a £1 coin is made of nickel and brass. And it would take almost 450 of those £1 coins to buy yourself the original £1 coin, which was made of gold. Now, today things are far, far worse because the nations are not printing those currencies themselves. That's something people have to understand. This currency is being loaned to our nation by private for-profit predatory banking clans that have managed to get control over the monetary systems. They print this money for zero cost, but they lend it at interest to our nations and then force us all to become tax slaves. That's why we are impoverished. That's why all of our land, all of our property, all of our assets are being taken from us in things like the Great Taking. That is how the scam works. But somebody is enacting this system. And if our nations printed the money themselves, there would be no national debt. So why isn't that happening? Well, of course, that's why it's so important to know our history. And hopefully these episodes are helping you to uncover it yourself. So we're living through all of this now, but despite the many flaws of a fiat system, and there are many as I've just laid out, it does have some important characteristics that are vital for us retaining our liberty and for having some semblance of a democratic society. And these are not related to the fiat nature of the currency, but to the physical nature of the medium of exchange. So this would be true for a gold and silver system if we had gold and silver coins still, but it's also true for notes and coins, even if they're made of cupro nickel or aluminium or brass or any other crappy metal. But the point is, having a physical currency enables the holder to transact privately, peer-to-peer, with no central oversight. It allows one, if they so wish, to pay for goods and services and receive payments for their own goods and services without any central oversight. And even though fiat currencies are centrally controlled in terms of their printing and supply, once they are in the hands of the everyday man and woman, there is complete privacy. So whilst the banksters were no doubt over the moon to get the plebs to accept worthless pieces of paper for payment, they also hated it because it still gave people privacy, it still gave them autonomy, it still allowed them to transact outside of a system and to escape certain taxation. And ultimately, the people who create these systems, they want control, they want complete oversight over what you do, not just the supply of money, but also the people who are using it, and that enables them total slavery if they get that. That is why the Book of Revelations introduces the beast system as a system in which people are controlled in terms of what they can buy and sell. They understood that that would be how the total control system would eventually arrive. So that wasn't by coincidence. They knew that was the final stage in the process of taking humanity from a place in which people had freedom and God-given rights into one in which they were usurped by man and would ultimately be controlled by evil, that is Satan. And here is the quote: "And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save that he had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name." So it's important to understand that when we discuss the war on cash, what we're really talking about is the war on financial independence. Nobody likes fiat money. It needs to be eliminated. But ironically, we now find ourselves in a situation in which we have to fight for it to remain, temporarily at least. What we then want to do is to turn the monetary system over to something of intrinsic value once more. But we have to protect it in the sense that the elimination of physical money is the final stage in setting up a system of total digital slavery for all of us. And yet, as we will find out, the fight began decades ago, and as usual, people had no idea what they was doing when they allowed their cash to be taken from them, and when they willingly adopted many of the systems that are going to take them to the slavery system, including most recently the final stage, in my opinion, which is cryptocurrencies, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Since China first issued currency notes during the Tang Dynasty, 618 AD to 907 AD, cash has been the medium of choice for business transactions across the globe. After the fall of the Roman Empire, silver and coins were used to facilitate most transactions for centuries. In the early Middle Ages, Venetian merchants began to use silver bars to conduct trade. Then they switched to written paper notes to bankers, instructing them to make transfers from their accounts. As time marched on, some type of coin or paper currency was used almost exclusively to make purchases around the world. In fact, for centuries, most consumers couldn't even imagine conducting business without the use of a physical currency. That changed in the mid-20th century when a New York businessman made the unfortunate mistake of forgetting his wallet when taking clients out for dinner. Little did the diners in the restaurant that night know that the first salvo in the war on cash had just been fired. So what this refers to is when in 1949 a businessman named Frank McNamara, he took his clients out to eat at a place in New York City called the Major's Cabin Grill. And he left his wallet at home, and of course he was embarrassed. His wife had to save the day. She did have some cash, but he thought to himself, well, I need to come up with a solution for this. And bearing in mind, this is what we were told, this is what we have been told historically was the narrative that led to the introduction of cards for payment. But whether this is true or not, I don't know, because I also know the story of how Bitcoin supposedly came to be, the story of how dematerialization of stocks and shares came to be, and every one of them is BS. So this one could very well be BS as well. But the story goes that he took his clients out for a meal and he didn't have the money to pay. And so he decided after this to create a diners club where you could just take out a card and this card would be accepted for payment. So he began with 27 local restaurants, and apparently it was so popular that by 1955 the card was accepted across North America, Europe, Asia and the Middle East, and it was called the Diners Club. So there was 1 million members and you could go to any restaurant and use this card as payment, and I think you topped it up beforehand and then carried it with you. So essentially you didn't have to take cash. Of course, the story doesn't quite make sense because if he forgot his wallet, he would have forgotten the card as well. But let's just put that one to one side for now because it's not important. But what is important is this was the first time we went away from physical money and towards something a little bit more abstract, which was a card that contained the means for payment. Now, it was in 1957 that the American Express card first came to be, and this was through the Bank of America. So they saw a change in business. They thought, right, well, I can see that these cards that people are using for dining could also be used for general day-to-day transactions, and they issued 250,000 cards before the official launch date in 1958. Apparently, demand was so high that they very quickly started to expand this one. And originally, these cards were seen as complementary to the company's traveler's checks. They could be used at hotels, for airlines, and other travel and entertainment industry establishments. So it started out more like a novelty. So you couldn't use it in day-to-day interactions yet, but this was how it all started. It began with Frank McNamara and his Diners Club card. It then expanded to American Express, and soon they got the idea that they could create these cards in which no cash would have to be used. So this was the first steps towards a cashless society. Now, what is really interesting is how Bank of America, or those who controlled the bank, because remember, these are private banks and they're all controlled by a very tiny minority at the top. When they decided to try and make some cards that could be used in day-to-day interactions, what we today would call a credit card, the way they did this was essentially by giving the populaces these cards for free. So they seduced people with their own greed. Now, this is very important to take note of when we consider how Bitcoin came to be. And I've got a quote here that tells us exactly how they did it. In 1958, the Bank of America representatives mailed 60,000 unsolicited Bank Americards, the first modern-day credit cards, to residents of Fresno, California. These were not applications to apply for a card. These were cards that were already open, registered, and ready to use, with a $300 credit limit for all card holders. The experiment went smoothly enough, so the Bank of America began dropping the term given for cold mailing these cards to unsuspecting consumers. Cards made their way across California, and by October 1959, more than 2 million credit cards, each with a $300 credit limit, had essentially been given away for free, unsolicited by post by Bank of America. Very quickly, Bank Americard was accepted by over 20,000 merchants in the local region. By the mid-1960s, Bank of America had sufficiently grown its credit card business that it began to sign licensing agreements with other banks and financial entities that would enable them to issue their own credit cards. The new cards could be rebranded with the name of the other bank, but for the time being remained a licensed product of Bank of America. It wasn't long before a number of banks were taking advantage of the issuing of their own cards, including Barclaycard in the UK, ChargeX in Canada, Carte Bleue in France, and within years the market for credit cards was exploding. In 1966, Wells Fargo launched the Interbank Association card, which consolidated much of the issuing of bank cards under one entity, MasterCharge. In 1979, MasterCharge became MasterCard. By this point, the banking sector had agreed that the cards would no longer be associated with a single bank and they would all hold the MasterCard name. This seemed to help it gain acceptance amongst the populaces as a tool for economic freedom rather than a tool for economic control. Meanwhile, the Bank of America, recognizing the opening up of the card market, gave up control of their own issue card, the AmeriCard, and in doing so helped birth the Visa brand, which would go on to issue both credit and debit cards alongside MasterCard for the world's banking sector. So between the mid-1950s and the 1970s, there was this rapid progression towards technological digital money. So this was using credit cards to begin with. And this was really reducing the essential functions of not just cash, but also checks, which was another form of payment. And checks used to be very popular. I remember when I was growing up, we still got a checkbook when you opened a bank account. Of course, today that's extremely rare, and most young people have never even seen a check. But during this period, there was lots and lots of development, and really the technology was now coming into its own that would allow things like credit cards and debit cards to really take flight. And of course, this led to all kinds of rapid developments across all financial spaces. So as we found out in episodes like the corporation who owns the world, it also led to the massive dematerialization of stocks and bonds, which used to be paper certificates. Now these could go digital. Now, of course, alongside all of this, there was lots of changes in terms of property rights. And that happened not just with stocks and bonds, which David Webb showed us in his book, The Great Taking, led to a catastrophic elimination of property rights. But this also happened in terms of our deposits, because remember, cash is a physical asset. But the moment we put our money into a bank, we no longer have property rights over that either. In fact, we are actually making a loan into the bank, which is how fractional reserve banking works. So in the past, people, if they were worried about a bank, they would take out their deposits, even if it was fiat notes, and they would stuff them under the mattress, under the bed, they'd hide them somewhere, and they would survive if the bank failed. So this, of course, was really advantageous for the banks, because not only could they lend money to people at interest using credit cards, but even using the debit cards, it would eliminate the use of physical cash. It would stop people from withdrawing their funds and give the banksters way more control over what happened to the money that was on deposit. They could start to use it to gamble in the stock market, which is exactly what happened going into the 1929 crash. It led to Glass-Steagall, but that was repealed later on by Clinton. And again, the banks started to create all manner of crazy products. And we got to the era of derivatives that led to the 2008 great financial crisis. Again, that was not possible in the old economy where you just had gold and you just had silver. It was the digitization of everything and the willingness of people to move towards financialized assets rather than real physical goods that allowed all of that to happen. In 1979, Michael Aldrich, an English entrepreneur, is walking his dog when he has an idea: teleshopping. It's not until 1984, however, when the first ever transaction is made, when Jane Snowball becomes the first teleshopper to buy cornflakes, eggs and margarine from her local Tesco via her TV, using her remote control to browse and purchase the products, which are later delivered. And I'm not going to go into the history of the development of the internet here. I think that's an episode in and of itself, but essentially it goes back to 1966, which was when all of these card companies were first coming around. That's when DARPA, no less, created ARPANET, which was a networking solution between different computers. They also invented the email as we know it today, and they managed to successfully send some emails later in the 70s. So all of this mass development was going on, and once we got to the 2000s, the late 1990s, the early 2000s, clearly the internet was really taking off. We had this huge explosion in dot-com companies. Then, of course, we had the dot-com bust. But what remained was the infrastructure, the digital highway, as they called it. And it was clear that using digital payments was going to be a key part of that. But it also opened the door to new types of payments, payments that would be purely online. And of course, there needed to be companies that could facilitate that. And in the background, whilst all this was happening, there was also the development of cryptocurrencies that actually began in the 1970s as well, believe it or not. And we'll come back to that one in a moment. In the mid-1990s, Pierre Omidyar began receiving envelopes full of cash, checks, and even loose change. He had just started charging users to use his auction website, appropriately named AuctionWeb. When the money started pouring in, he even had to hire part-time help to open the envelopes and help deposit the checks. As his auction website grew, it was renamed eBay, and it quickly became apparent that e-commerce would never thrive while purchases were facilitated with physical cash and checks. After unsuccessfully trying a number of in-house options, eBay eventually acquired PayPal in the summer of 2002 for $1.5 billion. Under the leadership of Silicon Valley luminaries such as Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, PayPal had taken over eBay's site, the digital platform being popular with buyers and sellers, and at the time of the acquisition, about 70% of all eBay transactions accepted PayPal as a method of payment, and 25% were closed using PayPal. PayPal quickly became the platform of choice for those wanting to make online purchases or through PayPal's person-to-person payment function just to send money to friends or family. So this is the story of how eBay had to find a new solution for online payments, and of course it acquired PayPal, and today PayPal has eclipsed eBay in terms of its size, and there's so many other online payment platforms. But again, this was all revolutionary at the time. There was a new technology, people were just getting to grips with the internet, and this spurred on massive development in the online payment space. Now if we go back to 2010, only $572 billion worth of e-commerce sales were taking place, which is tiny when you think about it, considering that by 2012 it was $1.1 trillion. Today we're over 4.5 trillion, so we hit 3.5 trillion in 2019, and it's growing about 18 to 20% per year. So today we've got more than 2 billion people regularly making e-commerce purchases worldwide. We've got 73% of total sales in 2021 taking place on a mobile device. And what's really staggering is most of these actual sales are consolidated in a very small number of companies. So for example, Amazon, eBay, Walmart and Apple, they actually make up around 62% of the entire e-commerce market share. And if you go back to 2018, 80% of the growth that year was purely down to Amazon. So if you want to know why there's all of these government and intelligence service contracts with these companies, now you know it's because they literally have all of the data on what we're buying. So if you're trying to build a digital enslavement system, those are the companies that you want to support. Now today, if you look around the world, around 1/3 of people make an online purchase at least once per week. China is actually now top of the e-commerce market, followed by the US, the UK, and then Japan. And the trend is that we are going in that direction at an ever increasing pace. However, interestingly, Generation Z is using more cash than the millennials, which is really fascinating because there was a TikTok trend and that's what actually got them using more cash apparently. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it says a TikTok trend that was about budgeting said it's the use of bank cards that actually has people spending more than they should. So the best thing to do is go draw all of your money out and go home and put it into different buckets for different things, and then you can only spend what you've got. But I would say the die is well and truly cast on this one because the trend is so strong in the opposite direction. And as we get into part 2 when we discuss Sweden, you'll get to see just how bad it has got in some places. But it's happening across the world, whether that's in Russia, America, China, India, Pakistan, Dubai, Australia. Wherever you look, we are moving away from cash and towards this new biometric surveillance state. And of course, cryptocurrencies are a key part of that as well, only not in the way that most people think. Though it has been in existence for just a little more than a decade, Bitcoin's history is full of twists and turns. In 2008, the financial world was crumbling, and in September of that year, Lehman Brothers Holdings, one of the largest banks in the world at the time, filed for bankruptcy protection. In the midst of the financial crisis, the domain bitcoin.org was registered by a programmer or a group of programmers using the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto. In January 2009, the first Bitcoin was mined and sent from Nakamoto to Hal Finney, a cryptography expert. The true identity of Nakamoto is still not known, and the person or people using the pseudonym backed out of the Bitcoin project in 2001 and has not been publicly heard from ever since. So by now, I am sure you're all aware of the story of Bitcoin's mysterious origins. All of a sudden, this man or group of people come out of nowhere and they develop this asset called Bitcoin. It's shrouded in mystery. Nobody knows who was really behind it, but it's fair to say that whoever was creating this thing was somebody who was a master of cryptography, and therefore they likely were engaged with some kind of high-level organization, potentially the NSA or some other intelligence service. Really, to be working at that level, you have to understand cryptography is something that requires decades and decades of work. There's only a few people on planet Earth who could actually make something like Bitcoin. And of course, it's based actually on an NSA protocol, which is SHA-2. So that's the protocol that underlies it. And if it came from the NSA, well, they have a history of backdooring pretty much everything that goes through their books. So for example, Crypto AG, back in the 1940s, so this was after World War II, there was a company called Crypto AG, and they started producing encryption devices for all of the world's intelligence services. The only thing was Crypto AG was a CIA front. And of course, the department there was the predecessor to the NSA, so it was eventually taken over by the NSA. And despite this going to all of the world's cryptography experts, so other intelligence agencies, not a single one of them knew that the devices they were using were backdoored. The entire time, for over 50 years, the NSA was listening to all of their communications, all of their diplomatic cables, because the devices were backdoored, but nobody figured it out, and even today they deny it. But this is just one in a long history. In fact, I've got a massive list, and I will do an episode all about the history of cryptography. That's going to be a huge episode, and it will really open people's eyes to just how important cryptography has been for thousands of years to the elite factions. So going all the way back to ancient Babylon, cryptography was always seen as the most important skill for keeping things secret and for ensuring that power remained in a small group of families. So to think that somebody came along out of nowhere and got the front run on these services who employ people straight out of university, they've got entire teams working on cryptography and predicting the future and where it's going to go and what comes next. They've got their own technology, which is decades ahead of what we've got. Of course, today they've probably already got super advanced quantum computing, which we don't know about. We only get the commercial stuff. They've got an unlimited budget and they work around the clock. And my point here is that to think somebody got the jump on them is pretty naive. And sure enough, if we go back in the history of cryptography, we can see that they were creating cryptocurrencies as far back as the 1970s. DigiCash was an electronic money corporation founded by David Chaum in 1989. DigiCash transactions were unique in that they were anonymous due to a number of cryptographic protocols developed by its founder. The creator, David Chaum, was concerned with the public nature and open access to online payments and personal information. He then proposed to construct a system of cryptographic protocols in which a bank or the government would be unable to trace personal payments conducted online. DigiCash was unfortunately unable to grow the company successfully through the expansion of its user base, and in a 1990 interview, Chaum stated that DigiCash and the technology entered the marketplace before e-commerce was fully integrated with the internet. In 1998, DigiCash filed for a Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and in 2002, the company was sold for its assets. Okay, so this was just one of many early forays into cryptographic money or digital money. So another one was Nick Szabo's BitGold in 1998. So of course the intelligence agencies were well aware of cryptography, they were well aware of digital currencies, and they were watching this space develop. They were funding certain developments, and they were also aware that one day everyday men and women would get their hands on these things as well. So they will have been planning for that and seeking to front run it, knowing that at some point everyone else would be able to have access to them. So they would have thought, well, we need to create our own versions. We need to create some deceptions that will trap people in these things, in our versions of them or in versions that we can control. But they were thinking about this a long time before Bitcoin ever existed. So you really just have to think this one through logically. And if you go to 1996, the NSA actually created a white paper called Making a Mint, in which they essentially described the Bitcoin protocol, only of course this one is centralized. Now, they will have been well aware that there was going to be no way they would get the public to accept a centralized version of a digital currency. So they would have thought, or the elite banksters would have thought, if we want to get people into these things, we need to get them to do it willingly. And then later on, we will come in with our regulations and we will engineer a situation whereby people have to use them. And of course, this is where the war on cash really had to escalate, to get people to go into these things, which could then be used to entrap them in a digital matrix and take us to the beast system. They needed us to do that willingly to begin with. And what better way to get people excited about these things than to make the numbers go up very fast and very quickly? Because of course that excites people's greed, and once greed is involved, people forget about morality. They stop thinking critically about what these things might do and where it might take us. They simply want to get in on the action. And now there's a whole host of these cryptocurrencies. There's ones like XRP and Ripple, which are sponsored by the World Bank, the IMF, Bill Gates. And again, people don't seem to care about that because the numbers go up. And if they think they're going to get rich or they're going to make a lot of money, they don't care about the morality of it. And that is unfortunately the way human beings have behaved throughout history. And now today, most people know what digital assets are. So it's all been a fantastic advertisement for the cryptocurrency future and the digital asset future, which was precisely where they wanted to take us anyways. This was the plan all along. They wanted us to accept the blockchain, to accept tokenization of real life physical assets. So the ownership will be registered without our knowledge or with our knowledge. We could even have our assets separated into 1 million pieces and sold off to all different investors across the world. If you've got a mortgage on the blockchain, that mortgage could be owned by thousands of hedge funds across the world. They could all own a piece of it. It really is a dystopia. But of course, the war on cash is a key part of this one. Reuters, March the 25th, 2024. Global bank messaging network SWIFT is planning a new platform in the next 1 to 2 years to connect the wave of central bank digital currencies now in development to the existing financial system, it has told Reuters. The move, which would be one of the most significant yet for the nascent CBDC ecosystem, given SWIFT's key role in global banking, is likely to be fine-tuned when the first major ones are launched. Around 90% of the world's central banks are now exploring digital versions of their currencies. Most don't want to be left behind by Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, but are grappling with technological complexities. Swift's head of innovation, Nick Kerrigan, said its latest trial, which took 6 months and involved a 38-member group of central banks, commercial banks, and settlement platforms, has been one of the largest collaborations on central bank digital currencies and tokenized assets to date. So as you can see, everyone, this idea that we're going to go to a central bank digital currency future is still there, but I don't think it's necessarily going to happen. In fact, it could all be smoke and mirrors, and we might actually see that they eventually adopt some kind of hybrid system where digital currencies like Bitcoin can be used as part of the system. Of course, it will all be centrally controlled. We have seen the co-opting of Bitcoin, and it may actually, from the very inception, have been something that was created by the very same people who are taking us to this future. You have to admit that recently it has almost certainly been co-opted. If you look at people who are around the space, so we've got BlackRock now, we've got Larry Fink saying, well, this is the future, people should be buying this. Then you look at the biggest holders of Bitcoin. The 3 biggest holders in the world is the US government. So the US officially has over 1 million Bitcoin. Some people think it's far more. There's of course around 2 million Bitcoin that are just hidden in this Satoshi Nakamoto's wallet. Nobody knows who he is. What we do know is his last tweet was sent in 2011, and it was a tweet to Gavin Andresen, who was a Bitcoin developer. And Gavin had said that he had just been invited to speak to the CIA, and he was going to speak to them about Bitcoin. Surprise, surprise. And he agreed to go to that meeting, and Satoshi Nakamoto never tweeted again after that. So he handed it off to Gavin. Gavin went to the CIA, and today people are genuinely thinking that Bitcoin is a tool for freedom. Well, I think that's extremely naive, because this was back in 2011. And of course, since that time, it's been adopted by BlackRock. And going back to the biggest holders, it's the US government, it's the mystery man Satoshi. Also, there is Michael Saylor of MicroStrategy, and MicroStrategy does all of the online platforms. They are an intelligence gathering company for the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, the US Army, the US Navy, NASA also. So these are the people who are the biggest holders of Bitcoin. US, the guy who works for the US Navy, military, Department of Defense, Homeland Security, a mystery man, and don't forget the Ukrainian politicians too. They own about 55,000 Bitcoins as well, so it's kind of like a money laundering tool, because of course when the price goes up they can sell some of that and get paid off. So it's a very dirty space, and I don't think it matters personally whether it's CBDCs or whether it's Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency. I think the whole space is captured, and it is going to be used to help bring about this new digital future where people own nothing and they are happy about it. They own NFTs, they have tokenized assets, and they have invisible cryptographic money that can be used to spy on them, track them, and over time shut them off, because it all has to be connected to what? You guessed it, the internet and the power grid. Now, we cannot leave this one without discussing some of the most recent developments in terms of the biosecurity state and how they are now implementing new payment systems that require you to give up your biometric information. And of course, this is only speeding up the move towards a cashless society, because people are adopting these things out of convenience. They think it's cool, they think it's great, without realizing that the net is getting tighter and tighter around them. They're giving up their information, their DNA, their biometrics, and they're also giving up, in a literal sense, cash and physical money that gives them privacy and that gives them freedom. And it's all being done because of convenience. You could soon hover your palm in front of machines to pay for your purchases at stores across the United Arab Emirates. That means no more swiping your bank cards or phones at cash counters after shopping. The rollout of the Palm Pay technology is planned to happen gradually in 2024. Abdallah Abu Sheikh, founder of the technology development group Astra Tech, told Khaliji Times the company launched the first payment solution through its fintech subsidiary PayBuy at the Dubai Fintech Summit. They will then be able to use Palm Pay technology for payments by only waving their palms at all merchants that adopt the innovative technology, providing immediate access and convenience, said Sheikh. The company said the technology is a more secure alternative to traditional card payments and other payment technologies. So there you have it, everyone. Soon you will be using just your palm, the mark on the palm in the right hand, to pay for your goods and services, or at least you will in the United Arab Emirates. But it's not just there, this is happening across the world. What about FacePay? Listen to this one. FacePay is a contactless fare payment service introduced into the Moscow Metro and the Moscow Central Circle. It is based on face recognition technology. To pass through the turnstile, passengers do not have to tap their card or even their smartphone. Data of FacePay users is automatically converted into an encrypted biometric key, which is stored in an anonymized form on the server. It is impossible to decrypt the key back into an image. When passengers pass through the turnstile, the camera converts the passenger's face into such a key and compares it with the keys in the database. To use the system, users have to link a photo of the face, a bank card, and Troika to the Moscow Metro app, look into the camera in front of the turnstile, which is marked with a special sticker, and the fare will be automatically paid. Payment transactions are the same as the transactions conducted when passengers use bank cards to pass through the turnstiles. Liveness technology distinguishes a real face from a photo and makes using someone else's photo to pay fares impossible. The biometric data of users is encrypted and stored on secure servers in accordance with the rules of Russian legislation. So even in Russia, some people say, well, Russia and the BRICS, they're going against all of this. They're going to take down the bad guys. Well, actually, no, they're doing all of the same things all across the world. This is a one world system they're trying to create. It may have the illusion of opposition, but ultimately they all want your biometrics. They all want you tracked, traced, controlled, and they want to make sure that if you are paying for things, they have the ability to stop those payments and stop you transacting if they so wish. And of course, this really is the beast system. Now look at Australia. In Australia, all branches of a major Australian bank are set to become fully cashless in a push towards completely digital payments. Customers of Macquarie Bank will no longer be able to withdraw or deposit cash or use cheques at any branch from May the 20th this year. Australia's Reserve Bank said the majority of Australians are using less cash, instead opting to pay for things digitally. In the 3 years to 2022, the number of cash transactions tumbled by more than a half. More than a half in 3 years. That's amazing, accounting for just 13% of all payments. Now, don't forget that in 2020 and 2021, when we had the scamdemic, they said to people, you can no longer pay with cash because cash is a vector of diseases. So you could go to the Starbucks, you could get handed a drink that somebody's just made for you, hand to hand, but you couldn't give them the cash because that was now all of a sudden dangerous. That should have been a huge red flag to people that something else was going on, that this whole thing was being used to engineer a new future to get people to go cashless. But of course, nobody understood what was happening because they're sheeple and they continue to go about as normal. Now, I've got many more quotes about how the biometric surveillance state is being implemented across the world, in Europe, in the UK, and of course in Sweden, and that's where we're going to go to in part 2. But I'm going to leave it there for part 1 because I think we've covered enough, and I'm excited to get into part 2 where we're going to be joined by Art Moni to discuss our recent experiences in Sweden, where we got to experience up close and personal what a cashless society is like, and also what it would be like if you got your digital wallet turned off and you have no cash, you have no physical means of transacting available to you. So plenty more to get into in part 2. Members, please head over to parallelmike.com to listen to the full episode. If you enjoyed part 1, we are only just getting started, and part 2 is going to be a deep dive into what we experienced over there in Sweden and some of the philosophical questions that arose from it. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this one. Members, I'll see you over there on parallelmike.com for part 2. Everyone else, I hope you're all well, healthy and happy. And like always, I'll see each and every one of you back here for the next one.
What you are basically. Deep down, far in, is simply the fabric and structure of existence itself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Chapter of St. Luke it is written, the kingdom of God is within man, not one man nor a group of men, but in all men, in you the people have the power.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women.
The fabric and structure of existence itself.
Honestly expressing yourself.
Peace for all men and women, for all men and women, for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, peace in all time.